The Reverie Guy!
I've mentioned a few times in the past that I have a pretty deep love for Tekken. I spent a lot of my childhood playing Tag Tournament 1 and 2 and some of my modern life playing 7, but something I've never done is go back to the classic PS1 trilogy. Originally, this video was intended to be only about the trilogy, but since I'm going back in time anyway, I may as well cover the complete progenitor ground. Most players who look at games from the past tend to stick to that time period to base their opinions, as if they can't measure and stack the quality against modern games. I'm not doing that. My take today is mostly based on how playable and good a game is from my modern perspective. Today, we're going to take a look at Tekken 1 through 5. That includes Tag Tournament, so technically it's 6 games, but Tekken 1 through 5 sounds like a better video title. Let's get started. First of the trilogy is the original Tekken, released in 1994 for arcades and 1995 for the PS1. Tekken was directed by Seiichi Ishii, who served as designer and coordinator for the original Virtua Fighter. The idea was to take the concepts of Virtua Fighter and give them higher detailed models and textures, a higher frame rate, and more fighting complexity. So pretty much what Virtua Fighter 2 did, but from a different team of people. The similarities to Virtua Fighter sort of begin and end with the visuals and the 3D fighting implementation. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but I can only get the stage to rotate along with certain attacks, so I'm assuming there wasn't any free 3D navigation by this point. There also just isn't much refinement to anything, and it really does feel like the first game of its series. The fighting is clunky, to say the very least. Each of the 4 face buttons is mapped to a limb, which means combos have to be executed by inputting various complex input strings per limbs. The majority of attacks don't have any chained combo if you tap them repeatedly, with a few exceptions, which makes the idea of mashing pretty much impossible. There's an initiative to learn how to play the game if you want to get good at it, but honestly, it doesn't really feel good enough to warrant that. This game is mad heavy and very floaty. I could see the popularity at the time considering it was part of a tiny subgenre, but this game is extremely dated in pretty much every aspect. The visuals are butt ugly, with most of the character models having improperly scaled body parts like an oversized head or comically oversized or undersized hands. The combos don't feel good to execute, and there were a few times where they just didn't even work. The blocking works for the most part, but that's the most clean part of the entire fighting experience. To the game's credit, none of the characters feel the same to use, and that means there's a lot of depth to learning an individual character's fighting techniques. The fight through the standard arcade feels comfortable enough, but something I just can't get over is how absolutely random the difficulty spike is. The entire ladder up until Lee is totally fine, but then Lee will throw this never-ending barrage of kicks that I just couldn't figure out. I got him to chase me kicking for almost an entire round, and honestly, it was hilarious to look at, but it's kind of bad. This relentless behavior comes out of pretty much nowhere, and doesn't exist with any of the other enemy AI. Heihachi's a baby fight in comparison. I'm just glad we got this game, because we wouldn't have gotten later entries without it, but holy crap, it's just not good to play today. Easily a 5 out of 10. This game isn't fun these days, and I don't recommend playing it unless you're just really curious about what the first Tekken was like. I'm sure at the time it was fine, but this is not that time anymore. Next is Tekken 2. The release is the same situation, originally in arcades in 95, and then 1 year later ported to PlayStation. Seiichi Ishii reprises his role as director, which works really in favor of the game because wow, is this one so much better than the first time. It takes everything that actually works about Tekken 1, and just refines the hell out of that to make it feel like a better game. Characters all feel much better to use this time, with combos registering with a more loose window and a wider variety of stage rotating moves. The 3D feels a little bit more emphasized this time than it did in the first game, and that's great. Fights in Tekken 2 are more exciting, and unlike the first game, there's a great snappiness to how attacks make contact. The character models look better, kinda. Some of them still have really weird scaling, but overall some of the more ridiculous things have been fixed, like Jak 2 no longer having the bulbous dome of his predecessor. The stages will all follow that same flat surface formula, but what makes them so interesting here to look at is the stage rotation. It never feels boring, and it only kind of looks terrible. They still are just flat billboard backdrops with a ground plane, so -1 for originality. That's really the only actually negative thing here though. Tekken 2 still feels pretty good to play. It's obviously dated. There's still some clunk in there like the over-exaggerated moon gravity, but it's such a superior game to its predecessors that they're barely comparable. Imagine if Tekken 1 had been given an extra year to hammer out all of the flaws and follow some more ambitious ideas. It's almost like watching a game move from its alpha to beta, where it isn't really complete yet, but it's clearly much better than it was. With all of that, I think I'll give Tekken 2 a rating of 6 out of 10. It's just a little bit better than before. It's not amazing, despite how much I enjoyed it compared to the first one, and it's still a far cry from being great today, but it is still one of the most legendary fighting games ever made. It's worth looking at if you've never seen it before. Final game in the classic trilogy is Tekken 3. The release situation is the exact same as last time, 97 for arcades, and then 1 year later in 98 for PlayStation. What isn't the same is the director. Seiichi Ishii doesn't return to reprise his role for this game. This was the first game headed by the current Tekken series series director Katsuhiro Harada, whose legacy stretches across the entire Tekken franchise. He actually began his work as the voice actor for martial law in Tekken 1 and 2. The love shows, and the change in direction was spot on. It isn't so much that the game needed a different director, but that the director that was chosen did such a bang-up job taking it to the next level, as did the development team. Tekken 3 is like the definitive start to the franchise. The 3D fighting finally takes full shape with 3D stage navigation, moves and combos that rely on the use of that navigation, and stages that do creative things with sprites to build a sense of character and memorability. The roster is the best of the three by far, and each of the characters that makes a return has a new and more varied set of moves to work with. The anatomy scaling has been completely fixed this time around, and it seems like they were really putting a greater focus on realism for the whole thing. Even the introduction FMV looks miles better than the previous titles. It's hard to believe that these games are even part of the same series with how different this feels. This is the snappiest, best looking, most easily recommendable entry in the original trilogy, and I would go so far as to say the gameplay holds up exceptionally well by today's standards. Easily this game deserves a 9 out of 10. This is way up there as far as fighting games go, and it deserves those extra points because of just how much better it is than the previous games and how fun and playable it is today. Next game in the series, and a game that I've been pretty eager to talk about, is Tekken Tag Tournament. Release situation is the same, arcade in 99, PS2 in 2000. This was the first Tekken entry on the PS2, and that means substantially increased visual fidelity, as well as cleaner animation and more detailed gameplay. It's worth noting that this is one of a select few PS2 game series that doesn't use the analog sticks, restricting movement only to the D-pad. That's not a bad thing, really. For anybody playing Tekken at home, this is what they would have been accustomed to anyway. It's also worth noting that overseas, this game was way more successful in arcades than it was on console, whereas here in the US, the console sales blew things out of the water, with an astonishing 1.61 million units sold. The game fundamentally is the exact same as 3, but with a few things that really changed the metagame a lot. First is the roster of characters, which by default is now like 4 times bigger than before. Next is the larger variety of moves, combos, directional moves, and other things which add even more depth to an already very complex experience. Finally, the most important feature, and the reason it's called Tag Tournament, the forced tag team fighting. Before a fight, you'll always pick 2 fighters. During the fight, you can tag between those fighters at any time and perform team combos that use both fighters for a flashy 2-person barrage. At some point, it becomes less optional and more essential, as you'll find that planning out your fights based around the current state of your health bar is really the key to playing this game. The red portion of the health bar is the portion that can be recovered when a fighter isn't in play. So when a fighter has taken a lot of damage, but can recover a lot of damage, you'll want to tag out for a while to let that health go back up. It gets to be a lot of in-fight micromanaging. I've heard it said that not many people can play and stick with this game for long because of how difficult it is to keep up with. The way fights play out is standard to fighting games, where the player who loses their health first loses the round, and you fight a couple of rounds in a row. You would think that having 2 fighters means having 2 full health bars to work with, but no. If just one of the fighters' vitality drops below 0, the fight is over, and that's game. It's especially difficult to time proper tagging, and a lot of the time you'll find yourself taking death damage if you make a mistake and switch characters at the wrong time. I can see how this would be frustrating if you don't want to do all of the management while you're fighting, along with learning your own characters and learning how to fight every other character with those characters. Personally, I love this game. I think it's one of the best fighting games ever made, and there's really no way to describe how close and personal it is to me. There might be some bias behind this, but I'm definitely comfortable giving this game a rating of 9 out of 10. It's really good. If you've never played it before and you like fighting games, it's a must play at least once. Pick up a copy if you can find one, buy a $20 optical drive on eBay, and play it in PCSX2 with the boot from disc option, if you don't feel comfortable creating a personal DOM. Like I said, it's not for everybody, but if it looks like it's for you, then definitely give it a shot. Next up on the list is Tekken 4. Same story, arcade in 01 and home console in 02. The critics seem to mostly like this game, but honestly big disagree. The default roster of characters has been cut down substantially from Tag Tournament. I want to say it looks better, but honestly it really doesn't. It's about the same. The fighting is a lot heavier and clunkier this time, which is just such a huge backpedal from the precedents the series established with the last 2. Fundamentally, it's still Tekken, with all of the major things kept in place and many of the combos getting minor refinement to make them a little bit cleaner. But from what I can tell, this game has a myriad of speed balancing issues. Character speeds vary from balls to the wall button mashing to comedically slow, which makes a lot of fights feel obviously stacked to one side. Damage doesn't really feel consistent between characters, but that's kind of true of most fighting games, so that's not really a huge hit. It's just that sometimes an attack will do a ridiculous amount of damage, and it just doesn't seem like an attack that would do that. It's more of a nonsensical to my eyes rather than to my knowledge of the game situation. The hit detection is also really unusual. Like, maybe it's just me, but it felt really overly lenient sometimes on the side of the CPU. I'm not sure if the game is designed to let the CPU do things that a player couldn't, or if players could do these same things too, but sometimes things just had a bit of overreach. You could see the space gap where the hitbox just doesn't connect to the model, and it looks very awkward. One thing I can definitely give the game credit for is the amazing stage design. This is now the second game I've seen that uses a shifting vertical height to change the fight dynamics, and there's also the new inclusion of stage walls for a bit of extra punishment. All in all, I feel comfortable giving Tekken 4 a rating of 6 out of 10. It was a huge step in the wrong direction, and I honestly can't recommend it seriously to anybody who likes Tekken unless the dynamic stages sound interesting. But it wasn't terrible. Even if you're a fan of Tekken though, there are objectively better entries in the series, and the only reason I could see going back to it now is because of the nostalgia or something. It's a lot like Tekken 1, where you can see what they were going for, but it just wasn't executed in the best way. Last game of the day is Tekken 5. Same story once again, but this time with a twist. Instead of a 2-year gap between entries in the series, Tekken 5 was the first game to get an extended development time. The arcade port was released at the end of 2004, and the console port was released shortly thereafter in the beginning of 2005. That means there was almost a 3-year period where no Tekken game was released. That was a very good decision, because this game kicks major ass. The roster of characters is huge, and the wide variety of stages gives the game a ton of personality. All of the bad decisions from Tekken 4 are gone, and in place of that, we got a lot of what Tag Tournament and 3 did well, but with a lot more polish. The game still feels a bit heavier, but with that heaviness comes a much cleaner combo execution window. Stage navigation is in full swing at its finest here, with some of the best feeling input registers I've ever felt in a fighting game. The much wider variety of fighters brings back that per-fighter learning curve complexity that Tekken Tag Tournament had, but without the issues of micromanaging 2 vitality bars to avoid a single KO. Something I am sad to see go is, again, the variable height stages. I'm not sure if that's something that players just didn't like, or if it was an internal decision to make the game feel more balanced or something, but it doesn't hurt the experience that much because the game's really nice to look at. I just miss them. Honestly, these are some of the best visuals of the era, with very few other games cutting it close. It definitely looks a little bit dated by today's standards, but from what I've seen, there are plenty of worse games from the exact same year. So for the time in the console, this game sets a really high bar. Everything said, I feel comfortable giving Tekken 5 a rating of 8 out of 10. It's not as close to me as Tag Tournament, but it's so much better than 4. This is one of the definitive fighting games of its era, and it does a lot of things that later entries would go on to replicate. It's not really a perfect fighting game, but it's worth looking at if you never have. And that was Tekken 1 through 5. My opinion on the series as a whole didn't really change much, but I wasn't expecting it to. The goal ultimately was to go back to something that I didn't have experience with, so I could look back on what I liked and didn't like about that experience. I don't really have nostalgia for many games from the 90s, because I didn't even see most of them until I was much older. And I feel like that definitely makes me more disagreeable than the waterspout of opinions that people older than me have. But I'm not trying to be disagreeable. I'm just relaying my experience into the vaporwave because everybody needs a hobby. I appreciate the privilege of having grown up in the incomprehensibly fast world we live in. For my entire lifetime, video games have had online multiplayer somewhere. Internet guides have existed to teach us things that we otherwise would never know. Visuals have been constantly improving. Gameplay technology allows us more complicated things, and more amazing representations of old works have been made on those advancements. So I don't think Tekken 1 and 2 are all that great, but from my experience, they weren't. I would have rather played Virtua Fighter 2, and I was pretty hard on that game. I am so thankful that we live in the age that we live in now, where I have a myriad of options that outweigh how short life really is. This video was a lot, but I'm glad that I did it, and I feel like I learn every time I do one because of how many new and different things I try. Thank you, and have a nice day.